So my migraine isn't bad enough. So I figured, why not do a Brexit video? Recently, in the last few days, it came to light that another key factor in the Brexit campaign was an outright lie. And it's one more thing on top of already a mountain of things that show that the whole campaign was based on lies. And yet, how many people still go for it? Tell a lie often enough and people will start to believe it's true. So what I'm referring to with this one, as I'm sure everyone knows by now, is one of the videos that came from the Brexit campaign, where in the video it portrays, tries to get the message across that you can leave England without getting checked, on a boat, head to France without getting checked, pick up a few migrants in the camps without being checked, and bring them back without being checked. Because we have no security, we have no control over our borders, because the EU won't let us do it. Of course, the reality, as we've just found out, is that these were all British people getting into a boat in, I believe, Deal, my neck of the woods, leaving the beach in the boat, remaining in British waters, and coming back onto British soil. If you're not leaving the UK, why would you need to be stopped and checked? So again, this whole thing was a lie. And they didn't go over and grab some migrants trying to get to this country. They were all British people. But again, when you sit down and explain this to someone who is a firm Brexiteer, it's palmed off as fake news because they have the established bias. Now this comes about from a number of different ways. First and foremost, if someone you trust says something, you tend to believe it more than anyone else. You don't necessarily research everything you hear because, let's face it, we have lives to live. But someone says something that you trust, you're more likely to believe that over someone you don't know who's saying something completely contradictory. Now, I myself was in this same boat years ago. Before 2014, I was a firm Brexiteer because one of the people I loved the most on this planet was very, very against the EU. So the things that he told me, well, I took at face value because this is a man that I trust, admire, respect. So of course he's right, and I have no reason to double check anything he's saying. The issue with that is that in 2014, I was unemployed and I was going through a training course, one of the many training courses that I've been through. Turns out that's when I found out that the training course I was on, and further research showed that every training course I'd been on through the job centre was funded, if not fully, then mostly by the European Union. At that point, Charlie Elfrick was already the Member of Parliament for Dover and Deal. So Charlie Elfrick, who has consistently voted to take away those programmes, wants to keep me out of work while the EU wants to put me in work. So from 2014, I started investigating the EU. Every little bit that generally people condemn them for. Now recently, I got into a debate with someone and they said, well, the EU control all of our laws. Something that we hear constantly. Now this has come about from tabloids, Eurosceptic papers, who have a very, very clear bias, and the BBC also has a very, very clear bias to leave the European Union. You just look at the coverage that they give that complete waste of human DNA, Nigel Farage. But it comes to that, and then you hear something from someone you trust, and oh yes, of course the EU control all of our laws. Now in this case he brought up, because again, I always go back to the same questions. Name one law the EU forces us to live by. Name one law you don't like that the EU forces us to live by. And name one benefit of leaving the European Union. And I say these things over and over and over again. And almost every single time I get the same reactions. So I keep asking, okay, what law? What law? Because if you're wrong, then your entire perspective of the EU has been misjudged because you're basing it on things that are wrong. So this guy brought up, we can't send paedophiles to prison for life because the EU won't let us. It violates their human rights. First off, it doesn't violate their human rights. What can happen in some prisons could violate human rights, and that's a very slippery slope I will get to at the end. But life imprisonment doesn't. But as this was a new one that I'd not heard before, I spent 30 seconds on Google researching. Again, 30 seconds, that's all it took. And I compared the average incarceration time for a paedophile in the UK compared to a paedophile in France. And on average, the UK is a much severer sentencing. It's about 5 years more. It's not much, but again, it's a more severe thing. It's a more severe sentencing. So setting aside for the moment that sentencing is different to a law, straight away that's debunked. Because if it was the EU telling us what to do, everything would be the same. The sentencing in France would be the same as in the UK. Now again, I just went to France because if I can prove that one country has a different incarceration sentencing, well then that's it, that's done. Because France isn't going to get treated any different to Germany or to the UK or to Spain or to Greece because it's the evil EU and they want to unify everyone. How dare they? But again, after putting forward this fact, it was shut down because of the established bias. So when it comes out, and we've had this from the get-go, that the Leave campaign lied, for the most part it falls on deaf ears. So, well, that's fake news. Of course they didn't lie. We have the documents. We can see clearly that the Leave campaign was funded by outside sources outside the UK. You should question why an outside source would want the UK to leave the EU, especially if you want more control for Britain. But that's being paid for the sources outside the UK. When it comes to sovereignty and everything else, okay, well, lie after lie after lie, so do we have sovereignty or don't we? Because the facts are very different to what the Leave campaign actually put forward. So it's either one of two things. Elitist scumbags are making you hate foreigners because that stops you from hating them and holding them accountable, or it's a massive conspiracy. Conspiracies are fun, but more often than not, they get proven to be fallacious. And then we get to things like EU legislation with, actually a brilliant example is what we are facing, a proposed legislation coming up with things like YouTube and video sharing. Now, I didn't do a video on this because Phil on A Different Bias did a much better video than me, and the only thing I could add really to that was putting in my 2 cents of watching big tech giants being interviewed by politicians and how completely clueless politicians are on a whole as to how technology works, how the internet works, how algorithms works, and search engine works. But essentially what's been proposed is YouTube has a number of copyright issues. People who don't own the copyrights are showing full-length films and TV shows and TV series, and they're getting money from this while it's blatantly violating copyright laws. So the EU, who again, the only 2 cents I could add to the story that Phil on A Different Bias put in was they're run by politicians who don't understand technology. YouTube refused to sit down and go with them, so they did what everyone who doesn't understand something does. Overreacted and came up with something that's a bit cack. Now this hasn't been put in force yet. It can be stopped, wait for it, by good members of the European Parliament that represent your interests. However, If recent polls are to be taken at face value, the chances are we will have more members of the European Parliament representing us who take after Nigel Farage. I have a massive issue with that complete and utter fucking wank stain, as he doesn't do his goddamn job. He would go over, bitch and moan a bit, and then come back, rather than doing his actual job of saying, well, hang on a minute, this is mental, this is overkill. I mean, the meme thing is an outright lie, but little snippets, well, that's an issue, and that's overreaching, that's an overreaction. But Nigel Farage and the people in his new party won't do that. Instead, they will take the paycheck and not do their job. Because that's what Nigel Farage, as a career politician, has been doing his entire critical fucking life. Taking the paycheck for not doing his damn job. If you have an issue with the European Union, and there are legitimate issues to have, these are things that can be rectified by contacting your member of the European Parliament. But of course, if we keep electing fuckheads like Nigel Farage to go over and represent us in the European Parliament, well, nothing is going to get done. The fisheries is a great example. People always cite the fisheries when, oh, see, the EU tells us what to do. They've taken jobs from the UK. A celebrity chef has done more to help fisheries in the UK than Nigel Farage, who should have attended the meetings about fisheries and our quotas, but refused to. Now he cites, well, it wouldn't have made a difference, would it? Lying piece of scumbag is the exact type of elitist prick that Jacob Rees-Mogg is, that Boris Johnson is, like Tony Blair and David Cameron are, which is to get you to hate them, because if you don't, you might start holding your own politicians accountable, and that's something that they really don't want to happen. I'm getting pretty fed up of people saying, oh, Brexit's not going to happen because Theresa May, we have a government who don't want to leave. The cabinet mostly has been full of Brexiteers and hardline Brexiteers like Dominic Raab, David Davis, Boris Johnson. Remember, he was Foreign Secretary, meant to build up relationships with foreign countries, make it easier on the UK in the future, and what did he do? Jack shit. Because he's an elitist scumbag, and there's no benefit to leaving the European Union. So how do we get into the mess that we're in right now? Constant lies. People unwilling to fact check it because some of these lies get told by someone that we like, someone that we trust. And now we're in a position where we've shown that the Leave campaign broke the law in regards to financing. They dropped their appeal. They have been fined £61,000 because they broke the law in their financing. We know that a huge portion of that funding came from outside the UK. We know that the hypocrites like Jacob Rees-Mogg have moved their business interests to Dublin or Brussels so that they can still benefit from the EU, and yet they still pretend that the EU is some big horrible thing. So many lies were told from the Brexit campaign, and yet when this is brought up, the most common thing I hear was, well, there was lies on both sides. See, because the Remainers said that the pound would crash immediately after the vote, and it didn't. So the fact that a number of people worked their asses off to avoid a prediction that would be catastrophic means that the Remain campaign lied. But no one is holding the Leave campaign accountable. BBC has shown over and over again their bias towards leaving the EU by not calling out these liars. At the end of the day, who's really going to suffer from this? People who aren't millionaires. Esther McVeigh is not going to suffer from this. but we are, food prices will not go down. It costs more to bring food in from further afield. Companies do not treat human lives with any kind of respect, so those costs are going to go up. Quite frankly, you're kidding yourselves if you think getting food from further afield is going to cost less. You're ignoring basic logic. The NHS has warned and is advising doctors, GPs, to not issue long-term prescriptions because they can't guarantee the medicines. People in my line of work are very, very aware that there is going to be a shortage of medication to help people manage and cope with seizures. And this again is coming from the NHS. But again, that is ignored. And even from the professionals being shouted down as Project Fear. Well, the NHS is lying because they want to stay in the EU. Why do they want to stay in the EU? Is it because there's this big conspiracy to unify the world that we all live on? Or is it because there are serious issues that no one has addressed, and when they're brought up, they're shouted down as Project Fear? Regardless of where you stand on leave or remain, we are not ready to leave the European Union. We're simply not. But we're heading for something catastrophic because we have Brexiteers coming out on TV every goddamn day spewing their bullshit, and they are not being checked.